August 12, 2000. The Barents Sea. To the uninitiated cartographers in Moscow or Washington, this body of water is merely a cold, grey expanse on the roof of the world, a strategic buffer zone separating the Eurasian landmass from the permanent polar ice cap. But to the men who have spent their lives navigating its currents, both above and below the jagged surface, it is a graveyard of ambitions. It is a unique hydrological theatre, where the freezing saline currents of the Arctic Ocean collide with the dying, warm remnants of the Gulf Stream pushing up from the Atlantic. This collision creates a volatile, fog-shrouded environment, a place of sudden, violent storms and blinding mists that has hidden the secrets of empires for a century. For 50 years, this ocean was the deadliest chessboard on Earth. It was the primary arena where the silent hunters of NATO and the steel prey of the Soviet Union played a high-stakes game of nuclear tag beneath the waves. The seabed here is littered with the debris of that conflict, a museum of rust and hubris where the bones of German U-boats from the Second World War lie alongside the crushed hulls of Soviet experiments that failed. It is a place that demands respect and punishes arrogance with absolute finality. But on this particular Saturday morning, the Cold War was supposed to be a memory. The Soviet Union had collapsed a decade earlier, imploding not from invasion, but from economic exhaustion. It left behind a legacy that was both terrifying and pathetic. The once mighty Northern Fleet, the sword arm of the Communist Empire, had been reduced to a collection of rusted hulls bobbing in the harbor of Murmansk. Nuclear reactors were being cooled by power lines connected to crumbling docks because the ship's own generators had failed, and there was no fuel to run them. Officers who had once commanded the most powerful weapons in human history were driving taxis at night to feed their families because the state had forgotten to pay them for months. The terrifying Red Fleet, once the scourge of the Atlantic, the force that had kept American admirals awake at night for 40 years, had become a ghost fleet. It was rotting at anchor, its paint peeling like dead skin, its sailors demoralized, its purpose lost in the chaos of the new Russian capitalism. The naval base at Vidyayevo, carved out of the granite rocks of the Kola Peninsula, looked less like a military installation and more like an industrial ruin, with packs of wild dogs roaming the streets and apartment blocks with broken windows patched with cardboard. Yet on the horizon something was changing. Through the persistent Arctic mist, a massive armada was cutting the water, churning the grey sea into white foam. 30 surface ships, 3 submarines, squadrons of Tu-22M backfire bombers and IL-38 maritime patrol aircraft screaming overhead, their jet engines tearing the cold air. This was Summer X, the largest naval exercise Russia had attempted since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was not just a training mission, it was a geopolitical statement. It was a message broadcast in steel and semaphore to the world, and specifically to Washington. The bear has woken up. The years of humiliation were over. Russia was returning to the high seas, and it was bringing its monsters with it. Standing on the bridge of the nuclear battlecruiser Peter the Great, the flagship of the Northern Fleet, Admiral Vyacheslav Popov watched his fleet with a sense of restored destiny. Popov was a man of the old school, a submariner by trade who understood the psychological weight of naval power, but he was also a man under immense pressure. He knew the reality behind the pageantry. He knew that the sailors under his command hadn't been paid properly in months. He knew that many of the ships in his formation were running on spare parts cannibalized from vessels that would never sail again. He knew the fuel for this exercise had consumed a significant portion of the Northern Fleet's annual budget. But today, none of that mattered. Today was about theater. Today was about proving that despite the poverty, despite the chaos of the 1990s, Russia was still a superpower capable of projecting force beyond its borders. But the true star of this performance wasn't the Admiral's massive 28,000-ton cruiser with its bristling radar arrays and surface-to-air missiles. It was Invincible, prowling 100 meters beneath the surface, hidden by the thermal layers of the ocean. It was the K-141 Kursk. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, one must first understand the machine itself, for the Kursk was not merely a submarine. It was a technological statement, a physical manifestation of Soviet doctrine given form in titanium and steel. An Oscar II-class nuclear cruise missile submarine, She was a leviathan of the deep. Laid down in the secret shipyards of Severodvinsk in 1990 and commissioned in 1994, she was one of the few ships completed after the Soviet collapse. She was immense, 154 meters long, longer than two Boeing 747s laid end-to-end. She displaced 24,000 tons submerged, twice the displacement of the American battleships that fought in World War II. Russian designers called her Project 949A. NATO intelligence, with a mixture of fear and respect, called her the City Killer. Her design philosophy was born from a specific Soviet paranoia, the American aircraft carrier battle group. The Soviet Union knew it could never match the US Navy ship for ship on the surface. The economic disparity was too great. So, they decided to build a sniper. The Oscar II was designed to sit silently hundreds of miles away from a US carrier group, hidden in the acoustic shadows, and unleash a swarm of P-700 Granite cruise missiles. These missiles were the size of fighter jets, autonomous, intelligent, capable of communicating with each other in flight to overwhelm American air defenses. To house these massive weapons, the Kursk was built on a scale that defied Western convention. To protect this precious payload, Soviet engineers wrapped the Kursk in a double hull, a feature rarely seen in Western submarines, which typically utilize a single pressure hull to maximize internal space. The Kursk was different. The outer skin was made of high-nickel steel, coated in 4 inches of specialized anechoic rubber tiles designed to absorb sonar pings, making this mountain of metal invisible to acoustic sensors. Separated by nearly 2 meters of water and machinery was the inner pressure hull, the steel cocoon where the 118 men lived. This double-hull construction gave the Kursk a reputation for invincibility. It was said she could withstand a direct hit from a standard torpedo and keep fighting. She was a swimming fortress, a bunker designed to survive World War III. Inside, she offered a level of comfort unknown to the claustrophobic diesel crews of the past. The sheer volume of the boat allowed for amenities that seemed luxurious in a military vessel. She had a sauna, lined with pine wood, where the crew could sweat out the toxins of long patrols. She had a solarium with sun lamps to combat the vitamin D deficiency caused by months of Arctic darkness, a small aquarium with exotic fish to calm the nerves of the crew. She was the absolute apex of Russian naval power, commanded by Captain First Rank Gennady Lyakin, a man respected across the fleet for his discipline and competence. Lyakin was a father figure to his men, a career officer who had navigated the difficult transition from the Soviet Navy to the Russian Navy without losing his integrity. His crew was known as the Golden Crew, the best trained, the most disciplined, composed of men who had fought to serve on the flagship. They were the lucky ones, or so they thought. While other crews sat in freezing barracks waiting for back pay, the men of the Kursk had a purpose. They were the tip of the spear, but beneath the polished titanium, beneath the medals and the pride, the Kursk was carrying a relic of a desperate era. A ticking time bomb disguised as a weapon. Loaded in the forward compartment, in torpedo tube number 4 on the starboard side, was a Type 65-76 torpedo. The sailors didn't call it by its technical name. They called it the Fat Girl. The Fat Girl was a weapon of monstrous proportions, 11 meters long, a warhead capable of snapping a carrier's keel in half, but its terrifying power came from its propulsion system. Unlike Western torpedoes, which had transitioned to stable electric batteries or safer auto fuel decades earlier, the Type 65 used a chemical cocktail designed for raw speed and range. Its engine was fed by kerosene and an oxidizer known as High-Test Peroxide, or HTP. HTP is a chemical nightmare. It is essentially super-concentrated bleach. In its pure form, it is relatively stable, but it has a fatal flaw, a chemical intolerance that makes it unforgiving. If it comes into contact with certain catalytic metals, copper, bronze and silver, or even simple rust, it undergoes a catastrophic decomposition. It doesn't just burn, it expands. The chemical reaction releases energy at a terrifying rate, expanding 5,000 times its volume in a fraction of a second, instantly transforming from a dense liquid into superheated steam and pure oxygen. The danger of HTP was not a secret to naval engineers. The British Navy had learned this lesson in blood almost 50 years earlier. In 1955, The submarine HMS Sidon sank in Portland Harbor when an HTP torpedo exploded while being loaded, killing 13 men. The Royal Navy investigated the wreckage, looked at the chemistry, and banned HTP weapons forever. They called them suicide pills. NATO navies followed suit, accepting the performance penalty of electric torpedoes in exchange for the safety of their crews. They understood that carrying HTP on a submarine was like carrying a vial of nitroglycerin in your pocket while running a marathon. But the Soviet Union, and later the Russian Federation, did not have the luxury of safety. They needed speed. They needed range to threaten American carriers from safe distances, and above all, they needed it cheap. The HTP torpedoes were fast, they were long-range, and they were inexpensive to produce. So, the Admirals ignored the history books. They ignored the warnings of their own chemists. They kept the fat girls in the inventory, gambling that strict maintenance protocols would prevent disaster. But by the year 2000, strict maintenance was a fantasy in the Russian Navy. The specific torpedo loaded into the Kursk, serial number 1336A, had been manufactured in 1990. For 10 years, it had been a warehouse orphan. It had sat on shelves in unheated depots in the Arctic Circle, subjected to freezing winters and thawing springs. It had been loaded onto submarines and unloaded again, bumped, jostled, and ignored. It was a practice torpedo, meaning it carried no explosive warhead, but it was fully fueled with the volatile kerosene and HTP mixture. Crucially, the rubber seals designed to keep the deadly HTP inside the casing had a shelf life of 6 years. By August 2000, those seals were 10 years old. They were drying out, cracking, losing their elasticity. And there was another flaw, one that no maintenance log could catch, a microscopic defect in the welding of the torpedo casing, a tiny, jagged imperfection in the metal, invisible to the naked eye, perhaps caused by a tired factory worker in Kyrgyzstan a decade earlier. When the Kursk left the port of Vidyayevo on August 10th, she was the pride of the fleet. But she was carrying a silent assassin in her bow. As she slipped beneath the waves, Captain Lyachin ordered the crew to battle stations. The exercise plan was ambitious. The Kursk was to navigate silently into the exercise zone, evade detection by the surface ships, and then on the morning of August 12th, simulate a devastating attack on the flagship Peter the Great. The mood on board was high. For the first time in years, they were doing what they were trained to do. They were sailors again, not just watchmen on rotting hulks. The cooks were preparing a special meal in the galley. In the turbine room, Captain Lieutenant Dmitri Kolesnikov was joking with his men, checking the gauges on the massive steam turbines that drove the propellers. In the torpedo room, the weapon officers were running diagnostics on the sophisticated guidance systems. They were surrounded by the illusion of safety. They trusted the thick steel hull that separated them from the crushing pressure of the ocean. They trusted their captain, a man who had led them through the hardest years. They trusted the procedures written in manuals that hadn't been updated in 20 years. But physics does not care about trust. It does not care about procedures. Physics only cares about variables, and in tube number 4, the variables were aligning for catastrophe. The microscopic crack in the weld was widening under the stress of the dive. The dried-out rubber seals were failing. A singular droplet of high-test peroxide was beginning to seep out of its containment. Just a drop. It was oozing toward the greasy, rusty interior of the torpedo tube, toward the copper firing mechanism. Above them, on the surface, the sun was rising over a calm sea. Admiral Popov was having his morning tea on the bridge of the Peter the Great. The world was watching the Russian Navy flex its muscles. The exercise was proceeding flawlessly. The surface ships were in formation. The aircraft were hitting their checkpoints. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the glory days of the Soviet Navy had returned. But down in the dark, the countdown had already begun. The Invincible Kursk had exactly 3 hours left to live. In the forward torpedo compartment, Midshipman Mahmud Gadzhiev and his team of 6 specialists were preparing the practice torpedo. They were the elite of the torpedo division, men who knew every valve and switch of the complex loading mechanism, but they were fighting a losing battle against entropy. As they connected the monitoring cables to the Fat Girl, they couldn't see the chemical reaction starting inside the casing. The HTP was finding the rust. It was finding the copper. The pressure inside the torpedo was beginning to rise, imperceptibly at first, then exponentially. At 11:28 a.m. on August 12th, physics collected its debt. Deep inside the first compartment, the 7 technicians were finishing the loading sequence. The tube door was shut. The outer hatch was sealed against the sea. They were ready to report, tube ready, to the bridge. They never made the call. The microscopic crack finally gave way. The liquid HTP surged out, hitting the kerosene fuel and the hot metal of the engine. The reaction was not a fire. It was a phase change of catastrophic violence. In less than 1/10 of a second, the liquid fuel underwent a thermal expansion that defied comprehension. The first explosion ripped through the silence of the ocean. To the outside world, it was a minor seismic event. 300 miles away in Norway, the NORSAR seismic array registered a disturbance of magnitude 1.5. To the analysts watching the needles, it looked like a small underwater earthquake, or perhaps a routine blasting operation on the seabed. It was an anomaly, a blip in the data easily ignored. But inside the Kursk, that blip was the sound of the end beginning. The pressure inside torpedo tube number 4 spiked instantly. The tube's outer hatch was locked shut, held by the immense pressure of the ocean. But the inner hatch, the door facing into the submarine, was the path of least resistance. The blast blew the heavy steel door off its hinges, sending it flying into the torpedo room like a cannonball. A jet of fire, superheated steam, and atomized kerosene vapor erupted into the compartment. The temperature spiked to over 2,700 degrees Celsius. It was the heat of a blast furnace. The 7 men in the torpedo room were incinerated before their brains could even process the flash of light. They vanished in the white heat. But the Kursk was a beast built for war, designed to survive the fury of a NATO attack, and she did not die easily. The blast wave from the initial explosion slammed into the forward bulkhead, separating the first compartment from the second. This wall of reinforced steel held against the sudden overpressure. It buckled. It groaned under the strain, causing paint to flake off in sheets and rivets to scream. But it did not break. The fire, the chemicals, and the superheated steam remained trapped in the nose of the ship, a contained inferno raging inside the torpedo room. For the next 135 seconds, the Kursk entered a state of purgatory, a terrifying interlude between the initial injury and the final death blow. In the second compartment, the command center, the situation descended into immediate, disciplined chaos. Captain Lyakin and his 36 senior officers felt the dull, terrifying thud reverberate through the soles of their boots. They felt the massive ship shudder violently, like a whale harpooned in the heart. The shockwave knocked equipment off consoles and sent loose manuals flying. Then came the smell. The air vents suddenly spewed thick, acrid smoke into the control room. It was not the smell of an electrical fire or burning paper. It was acrid yellow smoke, the distinctive, horrifying sign of burning torpedo fuel and propellant. Every submariner knows that smell. It is the chemical scent of death. Alarms began to scream throughout the ship. The Kashtan General Alarm System wailing its electronic siren, signaling a catastrophic emergency in the forward section. Captain Lyakin, a veteran of the Cold War, would have immediately understood that they had suffered a torpedo detonation. He would have been shouting orders, his voice cutting through the din of the alarms. He would have ordered an emergency blow of the ballast tanks to bring the ship to the surface. He would have ordered the engines to full reverse. But the explosion had likely severed the hydraulic lines running through the nose of the submarine. The diving planes, the massive fins on the bow that control the submarine's angle, jammed in a downward position. The Kursk, moving at a slow cruising speed, responded to the jammed planes by beginning an uncommanded dive. She pitched forward. The deck tilted. In the mess hall, coffee cups slid off tables and shattered. Men grabbed onto railings and doorframes, their knuckles white, eyes wide with a specific kind of terror that only submariners know, the realization that the ocean is taking control. The Leviathan was paralyzed. She drifted down heavier and heavier, sliding toward the abyss. 100 meters. 105 meters. At approximately 11:30 a.m., the Kursk hit the seabed. She plowed into the sediment at a shallow angle, grinding to a halt in the grey silt. She was wounded. She was blind. She was on the bottom. But she was still intact. Most of the 118 men were still alive. They were bruised, terrified, scrambling for gas masks to filter out the smoke, waiting for orders that would never come. They believed, or perhaps, that they had survived the worst. They believed that the double hull had saved them, that they would sit on the bottom until the fleet realized what happened and sent help. They were wrong. Because in the burning wreckage of the first compartment, the laws of thermodynamics were working on a terrifying timeline. The initial explosion had started a kerosene fire that was now raging uncontrolled, fueled by the oxygen released from the decomposing HTP. And the torpedo room wasn't empty. It was a magazine. Lined up on the racks, sitting right next to the burning wreckage of the Fat Girl, were 23 other weapons. High-explosive torpedoes, P-700, Granite cruise missiles. They were cooking. The internal temperature of their warheads was rising rapidly. The high explosives inside, designed to remain stable during transport, were being pushed past their critical flashpoint. The heat was soaking into the metal casings, destabilizing the molecules of the explosives. It took exactly 2 minutes and 15 seconds for the heat to win. At 11:30 and 42 seconds, the second explosion did not just destroy the Kursk, it erased it. 5 to 7 combat-ready torpedo warheads detonated simultaneously. The combined force was equivalent to 3 to 7 tons of TNT exploding inside a confined steel tube. The seismographs in Norway didn't just twitch this time. The needles slammed against the limiters, magnitude 4.2. Our shockwave so powerful, it was registered by sensors in Alaska, halfway around the world. It was an event of geological violence, a man-made earthquake on the floor of the Barents Sea. Inside the sub, the physics of the blast were cruel and unusual. The explosion blew a hole in the indestructible double hull the size of a cathedral. It ripped 40 tons of steel plating outward like banana peel, scattering debris across the ocean floor. But the water outside acted as a tamper, a massive, incompressible wall that contained the energy. So, the blast turned inward. The shockwave became a piston. It traveled backward down the length of the submarine, a supersonic hammer made of fire and pressure, seeking the path of least resistance. It hit the bulkhead of the second compartment, the command center, moving at thousands of meters per second. Captain Liakin and his 36 officers never heard the sound. The human brain requires a fraction of a second to process auditory input. The shockwave was faster than their nervous systems. The bulkhead disintegrated. The air inside the room was compressed instantly to hundreds of atmospheres. The command center was obliterated. The men, the consoles, the periscopes, the navigation charts, everything was reduced to debris in a millisecond. The wave kept going. It tore through the third compartment, twisting steel beams like wet clay. It ripped through the fourth compartment, the living quarters, shredding the solarium and the sauna, turning the luxuries of the Oscar II into shrapnel. It was a hunter, devouring the ship compartment by compartment, moving faster than the speed of sound. But then, it met the fortress. The fifth compartment housed the 2 OK-650 nuclear reactors. Soviet engineers, in their paranoia about nuclear accidents and Western sabotage, had built this section stronger than anything else on Earth. The bulkheads here were thicker, reinforced with massive energy-absorbing structures designed to contain a reactor meltdown. The shockwave slammed into the forward bulkhead of the reactor room with the force of a freight train. The steel groaned. It bowed inward. It absorbed a blow that could have leveled a city block. But it held. The shockwave lost its momentum. It dissipated into a violent shudder that rang through the rest of the ship like a bell struck by a giant hammer. Inside the reactor room, the automatic safety systems detected the cataclysm. The massive G-forces of the explosion triggered the emergency shutdown protocols. The control rods dropped into the reactor cores by gravity. The chain reaction stopped. The reactors scrammed. The heart of the Kursk stopped beating. This triumph of engineering, occurring in the middle of a disaster, saved the Barents Sea from a nuclear catastrophe. The ship was dead, but the radiation remained contained within the fortress of the fifth compartment. Silence returned to the Barents Sea. On the surface, the water boiled white for a moment, a massive bubble of gas breaking the surface, then settled. A slick of oil and debris began to rise to the surface, spreading slowly. But the thick Arctic fog hid it from view. The flagship Peter the Great was only 30 miles away. The shock wave from the second explosion was so powerful that it traveled through the water and slapped the cruiser's hull. The officers on the bridge felt it, a heavy, vibrating shudder that rattled the deck plates. A report was made to Admiral Popov. "Sir, we have detected a significant underwater acoustic event, possible explosion." But Popov checked his watch. It was the exact time scheduled for the torpedo launch. He waited for the radio report. He waited for the signal that the target was destroyed. It never came. Popov dismissed the vibration. Perhaps the engine room had engaged the afterburners, causing a shudder in the shaft. Perhaps it was a distant depth charge from the exercise. Perhaps it was the target ship exploding. He did not order a sonar sweep. He did not order a roll call. He assumed the Kursk was fine. The exercise continued. The fleet sailed on, leaving the grave of their comrades behind in the mist. But down in the dark, the Kursk was not fine. The bow was gone. The command center was gone. But the stern was still there. Behind the reactor compartment, in compartments 6 and 7, 8 and 9, the lights flickered and died. The main power bus was severed. The emergency batteries kicked in, casting a dim, sickly yellow glow over scenes of absolute chaos. Men were thrown from their bunks. Equipment crashed from the bulkheads. Pipes burst, spraying hydraulic fluid and freezing seawater into the compartments. In the turbine room and the auxiliary machinery room, men were picking themselves up off the steel decks. They were dazed, bleeding from ears and noses, deafened by the ringing in the hull. They checked the intercoms, dead. They checked the phone lines to the bridge, dead. They tried to open the hatches forward, but they wouldn't budge. Or worse, they leaked water. They realized, with a creeping, cold horror, that the front of their world had simply ceased to exist. The men in the stern were no longer crew members of a powerful warship. They were survivors in a shipwreck, trapped in a steel tube at the bottom of the world. Captain Lieutenant Dmitri Kolesnikov, the 27-year-old officer in charge of the turbine section, found himself the senior officer in a world that had shrunk to a few steel rooms. He was a man of remarkable composure, a hereditary naval officer who understood the mechanics of his ship better than he understood the politics that built it. Standing in the flickering emergency light of the turbine room, surrounded by dazed men bleeding from ruptured eardrums, he made a rapid assessment of their reality. The intercoms were silent. The main power was gone. The reactor safety systems had tripped, leaving them without propulsion or heat. But the most terrifying data point was the sound. The hull was groaning, a deep, metallic complaint as the 24,000-ton vessel settled into the silt of the seabed. The pressure gauge on the bulkhead told the final truth. 11 atmospheres. They were on the bottom. The bow was gone, and with it, the command structure of the ship. Kolesnikov realized he was now the captain of the Kursk. He made the only decision that logic dictated, which was to abandon the forward sections of the stern, where the risk of flooding and radiation leaks was highest, and retreat to the ship's last refuge. He ordered the survivors to move aft. One by one, the men from compartments 6, 7, and 8 began to crawl through the narrow intercompartment hatches, dragging injured comrades, moving backward away from the devastation. They moved toward the tail of the submarine, toward compartment 9. Compartment 9 was the escape tunnel. It was a steel cylinder at the very rear of the ship, barely large enough to hold a dozen men comfortably. Now, 23 men crowded into it. It was a diverse group representing a cross-section of the crew, officers, warrant officers, and turbine specialists. Among them was Rashid Aryapov, a warrant officer from compartment 6, and Roman Marchenko. They were bruised, burned, and soaked in hydraulic fluid and seawater, but they were alive. They pulled the heavy steel bulkhead door shut behind them and spun the locking wheel, sealing themselves inside a steel coffin 108 meters beneath the surface. They were now isolated from the ocean, but also from the rest of the world. The conditions inside compartment 9 began to deteriorate the moment the door was sealed. The emergency lighting cast a dim, sickly yellow glow over the huddled men, creating long, dancing shadows on the curved walls. The air was thick with dust kicked up by the explosion and the acrid, metallic smell of ozone and burning electrical insulation. But the most immediate enemy was the cold. The Barents Sea is freezing, hovering just above 0 degrees Celsius. Without the nuclear reactor providing power to the ship's heating systems, the temperature inside the hull began to plummet. The steel walls of the submarine, once an insulator, now acted as a conductor, sucking the heat out of the compartment and into the infinite cold of the ocean. The temperature dropped rapidly toward 4 degrees Celsius. Kolesnikov took charge of the survival effort. He inventoried their resources. They had survival suits, heavy woolen gear designed to protect them from the cold during a surface abandonment. They put them on, the thick wool offering a small comfort against the creeping chill. They had a limited supply of food rations and water, but their critical shortage was oxygen. The submarine's main air regeneration systems were dead. Their only lifeline was a supply of chemical oxygen scrubbers, metal canisters containing potassium superoxide plates. These plates are a marvel of naval chemistry. They absorb carbon dioxide and release fresh oxygen through a chemical reaction. But they are also dangerous. They generate intense heat when active, and they are chemically volatile. If they come into contact with oil or water, they can ignite or explode. The men set up the regeneration units, knowing they were sharing the small space with potential incendiary devices. The men settled into the darkness to make a life-or-death decision. They checked the aft escape hatch, a heavy steel wheel set into the ceiling of the compartment. In theory, this was their exit. The procedure was drilled into every submariner. Flood the airlock, equalize the pressure with the ocean outside, open the hatch, and ascend to the surface in their survival suits. It was a dangerous maneuver at this depth. An ascent from 100 meters without decompression exposes the body to the bends, where nitrogen bubbles form in the blood, potentially causing paralysis or death. The water temperature was lethal. Hypothermia would set in within minutes of reaching the surface if they weren't picked up immediately. But it was possible. However, the men hesitated. They didn't know the extent of the damage to the outer hull. If the explosion had twisted the steel frame of the submarine, the hatch mechanism might be jammed. If they flooded the airlock and the hatch refused to open, they would have wasted precious air and filled their only escape route with water. They also didn't know if rescue ships were already on the surface, if the fleet was searching for them. A dry rescue by a submersible was far safer than a wet ascent. They decided to wait. They decided to trust the fleet to come for them. While Dmitri Kolesnikov and his men were shivering in the absolute darkness, waiting for the sound of rescue, Admiral Popov was preparing for a press briefing on the surface. 6 hours had passed since the explosion. By now, the absence of the Kursk was undeniable to the Naval Command. She had missed her scheduled radio check. She had missed her surfacing schedule. The sonar operators on the Peter the Great had reported the seismic spike and the underwater shudder. Yet, the machinery of the Russian state did not mobilize for rescue. It mobilized for silence. The Soviet reflex to hide failure was hardwired into the Admiral's DNA. To admit that the pride of the fleet had been destroyed during a routine exercise was unthinkable. Admiral Popov stood before the television cameras and declared the exercise a complete success. He smiled. He spoke of the glory of the Northern Fleet and the high level of training demonstrated by the crews. Then he went to dinner. It was a staggering act of denial. In the Russian Navy, admitting a loss, especially of a flagship, especially during the first major exercise under a new president, was not just a professional failure, it was political suicide. The admirals chose to gamble with time. They hoped that perhaps the Kursk had simply suffered a communications failure, a broken antenna, or a power outage. They hoped she would surface on her own, battered but safe. They hoped for a miracle, rather than initiating a massive rescue operation that would alert the world and expose their failure. It wasn't until Sunday morning, nearly 24 hours after the disaster, that the Navy finally accepted the reality. The Kursk was not coming up. They launched a sonar search. The scanners found a massive anomaly on the seabed, an iron tomb lying at a depth of 108 meters. The depth was a cruel mockery. 108 meters is shallow for a submarine rescue. It is accessible. Commercial divers work at these depths routinely. Western rescue systems are rated for far deeper waters. In the West, a submarine grounded at this depth is a crisis, but rarely a fatality. If the Kursk had sunk in the Atlantic, help would have been hours away. But she was in the Barents Sea, behind a veil of secrecy and incompetence. As the Russian rescue ship Mikhail Rudnitsky arrived on the scene, the tragedy of the post-Soviet military began to unravel in real time. The ship carried Priz-class rescue submersibles, Small deep-diving vehicles designed to dive down, latch onto the escape hatch of a stricken submarine, and ferry the crew to safety dry and warm. On paper, it was a proven system. In reality, like the Kursk itself, these machines were victims of a decade of neglect. They had been poorly maintained, their seals aged, their batteries degraded. On Monday, the first Priz submersible was launched into the turbulent, grey water. It descended toward the wreck. Inside the Kursk, we can assume the survivors heard the high-pitched whine of its electric propellers buzzing through the water. Imagine the surge of hope in compartment 9, the sudden energy in the freezing room. They are here. We are going home. The men would have banged on the hull to guide the rescuer. They would have prepared the airlock, but the Priz was a lemon. Its batteries were old and couldn't hold a charge in the freezing water. As it maneuvered near the bottom, the power drained rapidly. The pilot struggled against the strong bottom currents of the Barents Sea, which buffeted the small vehicle like a leaf in the wind. He tried to maneuver the vehicle over the Kursk's aft escape hatch. He tried to mate the vehicles, steel ring to create a watertight seal. He failed. The current pushed him away. He tried again. He failed. The vacuum seal wouldn't hold. The batteries hit critical levels. The Priz abandoned the attempt and had to surface. On Tuesday, they tried again. They failed again. The weather worsened, the waves growing higher, making the launch and recovery of the mini-subs dangerous. And with every hour that passed, the air inside compartment 9 was becoming more toxic. The carbon dioxide levels were rising, making the men drowsy, giving them splitting headaches that felt like iron bands tightening around their skulls. The potassium superoxide plates were being consumed one by one, their chemical heat fading. The cold was seeping into their bones, slowing their hearts, dulling their minds. While the prize was flailing in the dark, the geopolitical game on the surface was turning deadly. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway knew exactly what had happened. Their passive sonar arrays and seismic sensors had picked up the explosions with crystal clarity. Almost immediately, the phones rang in Moscow. The British Royal Navy offered their LR-5 rescue system, the most advanced in the world, capable of docking at extreme angles and in rough currents. The Norwegians offered their specialized deep-sea divers, men who worked on oil rigs and could crack a hatch at that depth in minutes. They could be on site in 24 hours. "Let us help," they said. "We can save them." The Russian response was a cold, iron curtain. No. The admirals in Moscow were terrified. The Kursk was one of their most secret vessels. It carried their most advanced torpedoes, their encryption codes, their war plans. They viewed the offer of help not as a humanitarian gesture, but as an intelligence operation. They could not bear the humiliation of having NATO officers walking on the hull of their flagship. They could not bear the world seeing the rust inside their war machine. They prioritized the secrecy of a dead ship over the lives of the men inside it. So, they lied. The Navy press spokesman, Captain Igor Digalo, appeared on television. His face was pale, his eyes shifting, sweating under the lights. "The Kursk has experienced minor technical difficulties," he said. Then, he delivered the lie that was cruelest of all, a fabrication designed to pacify the public and the families. He claimed, "We have established radio contact with the crew. We are pumping oxygen into the submarine." It was a lie so bold it was breathtaking. There was no radio contact. The radio antennas were destroyed or underwater. There was no airline connected to the sub. But the families believed it. In the bleak naval garrison town of Vidyevo, where the Kursk crew lived, wives and mothers gathered outside the base gates. They stood in the freezing rain, clutching photographs of their husbands, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and hope. They held on to Captain Digalo's lies like a lifeline. Radio contact, oxygen. They are alive. They didn't know that their husbands were shivering in the dark, banging on the walls, waiting for a rescue that was being blocked by their own government. Inside the Kremlin, the paralysis was total. President Vladimir Putin, only 4 months into his presidency, was on vacation at a government villa on the Black Sea. His advisors, men from the security services who viewed the military as a state within a state, told him not to intervene. They told him to let the military handle it, that it was a naval matter. So while the sailors suffocated in the Arctic, the president stayed in the subtropical warmth of his villa, wearing a polo shirt, having barbecues with his staff. It was a public relations disaster that would haunt him forever. But in those critical hours, his absence sent a clear, undeniable message to the admirals. Protect the secrets. Protect the image. The lives of the crew were secondary collateral damage in the effort to maintain the illusion of Russian power. By Wednesday, the lies were crumbling. The Priz submersibles had failed 7 times. 7 times they had gone down, banged against the hull, and come up empty. The seals wouldn't hold. The batteries died. And from the deep, a sound was haunting the sonar operators on the surface ships, a rhythmic mechanical sound of metal hitting metal. It was the international signal for SOS. The survivors in Compartment 9 were banging on the hull with hammers or wrenches. They were telling the world that they were still there. The sound was picked up by the Peter the Great. It was picked up by American surveillance ships monitoring the crisis. It was the heartbeat of the submarine, a desperate plea for life that grew fainter with every passing hour. But as Wednesday turned to Thursday, the tapping changed. It became slower, weaker. The intervals grew longer. Inside Compartment 9, the chemistry of survival was failing. The 23 men had been trapping carbon dioxide for days. They were exhausted, hypothermic, starving. The air was thick and foul. The chemical oxygen plates, their only source of life, were running out. We can only imagine the psychological horror. Listening to the Priz land on the deck above them, hearing the metallic scrape of the docking collar, waiting for the hiss of equalizing pressure, and then hearing the propellers whine away again. Once, twice, 7 times. Hope is a cruel thing. It keeps you alive, but it makes the dying harder. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, 5 days after the explosion, the Russian government broke. The pressure from the weeping mothers in Vidyayevo, the outrage of the press, and the undeniable failure of their own equipment forced their hand. Putin authorized the acceptance of foreign aid. The British LR-5 rescue team and the Norwegian divers mobilized instantly. They flew across borders, bypassed customs, and raced to the Barents Sea. They were professionals. They didn't care about Cold War secrets. They just wanted to save the sailors. But they were too late. The tapping had stopped. The silence that returned to the ocean floor was different now. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a tomb. The Russian admirals had gambled with time. They bet that their secrets were worth more than the slim chance of rescue. They bet that they could fix their own mess before the world noticed. They lost the bet, and 23 men paid the debt. When the Norwegian rescue ship Seaway Eagle finally arrived over the wreck site on Sunday, August 20th, the difference in professionalism was humiliating for the Russian command. The British and Norwegian divers didn't make excuses about currents or visibility. They didn't talk about technical difficulties. They suited up. They jumped into the freezing black water. They went to work. For 7 days, Russian admirals had claimed the escape hatch was damaged, twisted, impossible to open. The Norwegian divers reached the aft hatch of the Kursk. They examined the wheel. It wasn't twisted. It wasn't jammed. It was simply closed. It took them exactly 20 minutes to manipulate the valve. On Monday, August 21st, at 07 hours, a diver gripped the handle of the outer hatch. He braced himself against the hull of the submarine. He turned. The hatch opened. In that moment, the last flicker of hope for the 118 families in Vidyayevo was extinguished. If there had been survivors in the airlock, or if the compartment below was still dry, air should have rushed out. Bubbles should have risen. Instead, there was nothing. Only the silent, dark water of the Barents Sea swirling into the open space. The airlock was flooded. Compartment 9 was flooded. There was no one left to save. The Norwegians closed the hatch. They swam back to the surface. The message they sent to the Russian command was brief and devastating. The submarine is flooded. There are no signs of life. It wasn't until October, when Russian divers began the grim task of recovering bodies, that we learned how the end actually came. The 23 men in Compartment 9 had not died of slow suffocation. They had not drifted peacefully into sleep as the carbon dioxide rose. Their end had been violent. Forensic analysis of the compartment revealed burn marks, severe thermal damage. The investigators reconstructed the final moments. Sometime during the waiting, perhaps 6 hours after the explosion, perhaps 2 days, we will never know exactly, an accident occurred. In the pitch black, With men exhausted and wading in freezing, oily water, someone likely dropped a chemical oxygen cartridge, or perhaps the water rose high enough to touch the hot chemical plates. When potassium superoxide touches oil and water, it creates a blowtorch. A flash fire erupted in the sealed steel cylinder. It would have consumed the remaining oxygen in seconds. The temperature spiked instantly. The men didn't drown. They didn't suffocate slowly. They were burned or asphyxiated by the sudden vacuum. The tapping stopped because the fire took them. But before the fire, there was the writing. When divers recovered the body of Captain Lieutenant Dmitri Kolesnikov, they found moisture-damaged paper in his pocket. The Russian Navy tried to hide it. They released only snippets. They claimed it was illegible. But the truth, like the Kursk itself, eventually surfaced. Kolesnikov's note is the moral anchor of this tragedy. It transforms the Kursk from an industrial accident into a human epic. In the flickering darkness, surrounded by the groans of the dying ship, knowing he was going to die, he acted like an officer. He didn't write a manifesto. He didn't curse his superiors. He wrote a roll call. He listed every man present. He noted who was injured. He wrote that all personnel from sections 6, 7, and 8 had moved to the 9th section. There were 23 of them. They had made that decision because none of them could escape. And then, his final words to his wife, Olga, scrawled in the dark when hope was fading. He told her that he loved her, asked her not to grieve too much, sent regards to everyone, and famously wrote that there was no need to be desperate. He wrote those words in the dark, knowing he was going to die, while his president was barbecuing at a villa and his admirals were lying to cameras. The contrast between the dignity of the sailor and the cowardice of the state remains the defining image of the disaster. The rage in Russia was volcanic. In a now infamous press conference in Vidyayevo, the admirals faced the wives and mothers. The meeting was chaotic. Women were screaming, demanding to know why foreign help wasn't accepted sooner. One woman, Nadezhda Tilik, mother of Lieutenant Sergei Tilik, stood up. She screamed at the deputy prime minister. She demanded to know why they sat in their fat chairs while the boys were dying in tin cans. She asked what their medals were for, if not for killing their sons. As she screamed, the cameras kept rolling. And then, the world saw the true face of the regime. A nurse stepped up behind her. She didn't offer water. She didn't offer comfort. She plunged a syringe of sedative into the grieving mother's shoulder through her coat. Nadezhda Tilik collapsed into a chair, silenced. It was a metaphor for the entire event. The state would rather drug the truth than face it. A year later, a massive barge raised the Kursk from the seabed. They brought her home. When they drained the water in the dry dock, seasoned shipyard workers wept. The buoy was a mangled ruin, a testament to the terrifying power of the fat girl. The investigation officially blamed the faulty weld on the torpedo. It blamed the HTP fuel, but the true cause wasn't found in the wreckage. It was found in the budget reports of the 1990s. It was found in the cancelled maintenance schedules. It was found in the hubris of a naval command that believed Invincible was an engineering fact, not a marketing slogan. The fat girls were finally retired from service. The Russian Navy slowly began to modernize, shamed into reform by the disaster. But for 118 men, the reform came too late. The Barents Sea is quiet today. The Kursk has been cut up for scrap, her metal recycled into new machines, perhaps new ships. But the story remains. It is a story about the cost of arrogance. It is a reminder that the ocean is the most hostile environment on Earth. It does not forgive mistakes. It does not care about national pride. And above all, it is a lesson in the value of truth. The Kursk didn't die because of a torpedo. She died because of a system that couldn't admit it was broken. 118 men, 118 sons. Rest in peace.